Welcome to the 11th Annual Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick Memorial Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies. I'm Sean Desilets, and along with Professor Keith Vincent, who is right there, I coordinate the BU Gender and Sexuality Studies group. It's my job today to just say a few words about the Sedgwick Lecture Series in general, to thank a bunch of people who helped make it possible, and then to hand things over to my colleague Petrus Liu, who in turn will introduce Heather Love. The BU Gender and Sexuality Studies group, otherwise known as GenSex, is a group of faculty members who have been gathering to read work together in gender and sexuality studies across disciplines since 2007. The Sedgwick Lecture, which you're of course at, is our biggest event of the year. Eve Sedgwick, for those of you who don't know, was one of Queer Theory's founders. She taught here at BU in the 80s. Upon hearing of her death, her tragically early death in spring of 2009, the members of GenSex decided to hold a conference here at BU in her honor. They called it Honoring Eve and invited 13 speakers to come and share their thoughts and memories about Eve and her work. Some of those people are in this room right now. It was such a great success that GenSex has kept the spirit going with an annual lecture in Eve's honor. I mentioned that I have people to thank. I want to start by thanking Letitia Castillo-Brachet, a PhD candidate in philosophy here at BU, for her deft handling of many, many logistical details. Our biggest financial lift came from the BU Center for the Humanities. Particular thanks to BUCH's director, Susan Misraki, and its administrator, Tamsin Flanders. The video recording of the lecture was sponsored by the Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick Foundation and Hal Sedgwick. Hal has been a stalwart supporter of the Sedgwick Lecture, and we are deeply grateful for his involvement and for his presence here tonight. Thanks also to our BU co-sponsors, the departments of English, History, Religion, Romance Studies, Sociology, and World Languages and Literature. Also, the programs in African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, the Office of the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, and the LGBTQIA+ Center for Faculty and Staff. One quick invitation. Tomorrow at noon, GenSex will host a lunch Q&A with Heather Love for students. We'll provide lunch, so I know that's often very valuable to students. That's tomorrow at noon in the Eichenbaum Colloquium Room at the Killichin Center for Integrated Life Sciences and Engineering, which is also called SILSE. SILSE is at 610 Commonwealth Ave, so come to lunch. Finally, I want to bring on Professor Petrus Liu. That's his book. Who will introduce our speaker. Professor Liu is Associate Professor in World Languages and Literature and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at BU. He is among the world's leading scholars of queer Marxism. His breathtaking new book, which you can see right here, is The Specter of Materialism, Queer Theory and Marxism in the Age of the Beijing Consensus. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Petrus Liu. I teach in the Department of World Languages and Literatures and WGS at BU. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker for the 11th Annual Eve Sedgwick Memorial Lecture in Gender and Sexuality Studies, Professor Heather Love. Heather Love is Professor of English at UPenn. Professor Love and her work really need no introduction to those working in gender and sexuality studies. Heather Love's work has ignited a paradigm shift in queer theory. To many of us, Heather Love represents the very best of a new generation of queer thinkers whose critical writing on the politics of affect has made it possible for us to bring together traditionally polarized terms such as the psychic and the social, subject and structure, the potentialities of the future, and the trauma of the past. Heather Love's first book, Feeling Backward, was the most forward-thinking book I have ever read. Intellectually and politically, this book was simply ahead of its time. Its publication in 2009 brought about nothing less than a sea change in queer studies, describing backwardness both as a queer historical structure of feeling and as a model for queer historiography. Love resists the affirmative turn in queer studies and chooses instead to dwell on the account of nostalgia, shame, self-hatred, bitterness, defeatism, and loneliness in late 19th century and early 20th century literary texts. Love urges us to reckon with their powerful legacies instead of refunctioning such experiences into the normalizing language of affirmative gay politics. Professor Love's pioneering work on shame and stigma in Looking Backward laid the groundwork for another interventionist text, her 2021 monograph, Underdogs. In Underdogs, Heather Love explores how the field of queer studies was shaped by the Cold War era world of deviance studies, with attention to the emergence of deviance research in the 1950s and 1960s on drug addicts, homosexuals, drag queens, Jews, disabled people, and political radicals. Heather Love proposes an alternative genealogy of queer theory with an emphasis on its indebtedness, on its intellectual debts to mid-century social sciences. Other than these two monumental monographs, Heather Love has also edited the important special issue of GLQ on Gayle Rubin, but her many contributions are not limited to queer studies. Her work on literary ethics and the descriptive turn has become one of the most influential models of literary interpretation in recent years. Heather Love is duly loved by many. I'm extremely excited about the talk tonight, which represents her latest thinking on the defining tension between personal authenticity and subjectless critique in queer theory. Please join me in welcoming Professor Heather Love.
Wow. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Petrus, for that really nice introduction. Thank you to everyone for inviting me, to Letitia for setting up my visit, and to Hal for making this possible. I really take it as a great honor to be here today. It was amazing to be at the Regarding Sedgwick, Honoring Sedgwick event in 2009. I, like many people in this room, have been thinking very deeply and closely about Sedgwick's work for really my whole career. Feeling Backward and Underdogs are both heavily indebted to her, both in citations and more broadly. And probably this new work is even more obviously indebted. So I just really, really appreciate the chance to be here in this venue speaking to you. Also just thinking back about to 2009 and to how significant being here and also participating in the issue of criticism afterwards was as a way of marking Eve's passing. And I couldn't help thinking in preparing for this talk about the other people who are no longer here in that time, many of whom are or were deeply engaged in Sedgwick's project, broadly conceived. So I'm just going to remember them here. Jonathan Goldberg, Leo Bersani, Sam C., Chris Chitty, Lauren Berlant, Douglas Kremp, and Jose Munoz. And I'm sure that's not a complete list, but I did want to mention them. Okay, so let me start by saying that this is part of a new book project, and that's the title, To Be Real, The Passion of the Self in Queer Writing. And it does address the way that a field deeply influenced by post-structuralism and its questioning of both the self and the real dealt with material realities, questions of the body, desire, violence, sex, and death. Some of you may recognize the origin of the title, taken from the 1978 Cheryl Lynn hit, Got to Be Real, released in 1978 and tuned to the frequency of the dance floor. I'm not referring only to its 115 beats per minute 4/4 rhythm, or to Lynn's miraculous vocal stylings, but the song also tracks the euphoria and the fast-moving intimacy of the dance floor. In this world, what you feel now very quickly becomes what you know to be real. And if one moment I think I love you, it is not long before I decide that our love is here to stay. I think I'm going to do that kind of thing I've seen people do, but I've never done, which is like, I'm out of here, okay. But just because there's not much room up here, all right. Okay, I won't drop the mic, though, I promise. The song both celebrates and puts interpretive pressure on realness. It's got to be real, but that is not what pop mega hits or the disco nightlife is known for. The song ends up with Lynn repeatedly repeating, "It's time to be real. It's time to be real. It's time to be real." Yes, in 1978, it was time to be real. That's why Sandra Bernhardt begins her Free at Last monologue in Without You I'm Nothing with the line, "Okay, pretend it's 1978 and you're straight." If you know the monologue, you know that you're not straight for very long. Lights, Sylvester, poppers, boom, you're not straight. Lynn's anthem demands that its listeners get real, that is to say, obey the evidence of your senses, pay attention to what you feel now, be open to what you find, and experience real love. The fact that love could be experienced under the unreal lights of a disco ball does not make it less real. For many people, it was the first real love that they had known. But it does affect the definition of reality. The dual status of real in the song presumably led to its inclusion in Paris is Burning. In that documentary, Got to Be Real, after all, realness is similarly raked over the interpretive coals. In ball culture, contestants walking the realness category have got to be real. That's to say, they've got to approximate cisgender femininity, but what then is realness? To Be Real, the book explores a defining paradox in queer writing, which both undermines the real, but also insists on it. There are many ways to describe this dynamic, but let me offer one version as a short précis. The rise of queer theory around 1990 occurs in tandem with two intellectual movements, post-structuralism and identity politics. The combination of philosophical skepticism about identity on the one hand and investment in minority experience on the other is the signature of queer writing. Since its inception, queer criticism has been known for its rigorous interrogation of the grounds of personhood, but it is also known for its renovation of academic style in the direction of the personal. Early critics broke with scholarly convention to include narrative, slang, obscenity, song lyrics, and passages of heightened emotion. The tension between subjectless critique and self-revelation is everywhere in the field, but it has mostly gone unnoticed, or unremarked, let's say. It is visible in two signal statements from the early 1990s, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, in which she cites Nietzsche's dictum that there is no doer behind the deed, to question the grammar of the self. At almost the same time, Sedgwick countered a century of writing about homosexuality from a clinical distance, arguing that, quote, queer can only properly signify in the first person. In the book, I address this tension, which insists at once on the undermining of the self and on personal revelation, honesty, and authenticity as values. So I think, I'm citing Sedgwick there, but I think for those of you who know her work, it's clear how deeply indebted this project is to her, in that she's responsible for the birth of the field as we know it, relentless questioning of the truisms of identity and of taken for granted distinctions between gay and straight, male and female, and so on, that had seemed before her writing and the writing of her peers beyond critique. But she also insisted, particularly in her turn to affect and embodiment, that it's got to be real. Today, I will explore questions of reality and truth in Sedgwick's work, particularly in relation to David Koenig's 2020 call to get real, for the field to get real, about the moral seriousness of queer theory. I will then turn to a classic essay in queer trans theory from the early 1990s. That's to say Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Performing Transgender Rage, to explore what I see as this defining tension in more detail. Okay, the paper is in two parts. Part one is called, What If She Meant It? What If It's True? David Koenig's 2020 essay, A Few Lies, Queer Theory and Our Method Melodramas, is primarily an interrogation of what he sees as the melodramatic nature of the method wars or reading method debates in literary studies. He sees in this miniature tradition a mistaken and contemptuous view of the work that literary critics actually do, one that is dangerously in league with a general contempt for academic criticism in the humanities. A key problem in his view with texts like Rita Felsky's The Limits of Critique or Sharon Marcus and Stephen Best's essay on surface reading is that they actually do not address reading methods. Instead, they offer what Koenig repeatedly calls characterology, by which he means that these essays do not engage with actual reading, but instead paint critics and theorists as particular kinds of people. And the kinds of people they are is not good. For any of you who know these essays, what are critics like? Well, they're arrogant, suspicious, aggressive, grandiose, paranoid. For Koenig, this is a problem both because it adds fuel to the fire currently burning down our profession, but also it significantly mischaracterizes the project of queer criticism. Queer criticism is central to such state-of-the-field debates in literary studies because, well, many of the people who work in these, who write on these debates identify as queer, other parts of their work have dealt with LGBT issues or whatever, but also because queer criticism, queer theory, has largely set the terms for several of these debates. And yet, as Koenig points out, so many invocations of queer criticism are diminishing or trivializing of its arguments. Queer thought is bound up with the method debates. It has, as Koenig argues, long engaged with just the questions that are central to these debates, such as the moods of criticism, the relationship between textual analysis and activism, and reading. In the words and reading, in the words of Charles Dickens, as via D.A. Miller, reading as if for life. These are questions that have been central to queer theory, but also come up in the method debates. But it's the deletion of AIDS as an animating context for queer thought that is at the hot center of Koenig's essay, A Few Lies. Koenig takes the title, A Few Lies, from the opening line of Leo Bersani's 1987 essay, Is the Rectum a Grave? We have been telling a few lies. That's the opening line. Bersani was debunking what he saw as the idealization of gay sex as democratizing and egalitarian in the context of the AIDS emergency. Koenig places Bersani in a tradition of queer truth-telling that he links to the get over yourself atmosphere of the gay bar, but also to the AIDS crisis. Reflecting on the history of the field, Koenig emphasizes that the field's reputation for style and postmodern play does not acknowledge its other moods and tones. He writes, revisit the prominent critical work produced in gay lesbian studies in the 80s and 90s, and it's striking, if entirely unsurprising, how frequently the names of the recently dead are invoked in the writing of D.A. Miller, Kobina Mercer, Douglas Crimp, Jeff Nunakawa, Carolyn Dinshaw, Robert Reed Farr, Patricia White, Cindy Patton, Bersani, Philip Bryan Harper, Lee Edelman, Eve Sedgwick, David Halperin, Robin Wiegman, Thomas Yingling, not only in the objects of their inquiry, but in the matrix of their acknowledgments, footnotes, dedications. The dominant affects are sorrow and rage, and when style or wit are deployed, as they often are, they are scored with those emotions. Sedgwick is a key figure here, but her place in Koenig's article is complex. On the one hand, Sedgwick gave rise to the method wars, and in the form that Koenig excoriates. So he sees behind Felsky and Best and Marcus, he sees Sedgwick's essay on paranoid and reparative reading. With that essay, Paranoid and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid, You Probably Think This Essay Is About You, Sedgwick opened an investigation into reading methods that was, as Koenig and others have noted, not so much about method as it was about ethics, psychology, mood, and disposition. For Koenig, this is a problem, and he calls it a melodrama because it pits, Sedgwick's essay pits a glowering, paranoid reader against a loving, attentive, generous reader who only seeks to repair. Such simplification misses both the mixed emotion of criticism and the mixed motives of critics. Koenig is particularly disappointed with Sedgwick in this regard because he looks to her for just the opposite impulse. He writes, There are no doubt connections to be drawn among a critic's psychic orientation toward the world, the hermeneutic tools she deploys when engaged in literary interpretation, and the effect the reading she produces has on readers, students, and the discipline for which her words may become decisive. But those relationships are tortuous. And Sedgwick is elsewhere one of our best theorists of the twisty affective energies that flow between a psychology and a text and a method, a reading and an audience. But even more than the melodramatizing of method in paranoid reading and reparative reading, Carnick bemoans the displacement of AIDS as an urgent reality in the essay. The essay begins, as is well known, with a reported dialogue between Sedgwick and Cindy Patton, who suggests that determining whether or not HIV was a clandestine plot by the US military is not an urgent concern. What would we know then that we don't already know, Patton asks. Patton's point is that whether or not we adopt a paranoid view of the AIDS epidemic, we would still do the same things to fight it. Activist methods remain the same. For Sedgwick, this is a lesson in the performativity of knowledge. It is far less important to establish truth in an abstract sense than to consider what truth or knowledge can make happen. But it is also a pivot point in the essay, as Carnick points out, moving it away from the question of what is to be done to the question of what do we feel. Given that it doesn't make a difference in our actions, whether we are paranoid or not, is it better to be paranoid or to undertake the work of psychic repair? This is not Patton's question, but it has become ours. To the extent that Sedgwick's focus on the performativity of knowledge and on affect have led to a disregard of AIDS as a material condition for the emergence of the field, Carnick pushes back. Contesting the accepted timeline of the affective turn in both queer and literary studies, Carnick writes, quote, "This genealogy might well be a decade before the word affect achieved discipline-wide currency. The AIDS catastrophe had given criticism the thing itself." So long before everyone was doing affective criticism, the AIDS crisis had given us affect, and furthermore, the trace of it is all over queer criticism of the period. In place of affect studies, Carnick suggests real feeling, real rage, and grief about AIDS. Real feeling is in evidence here in Carnick's anger, in Carnick's essay, in his anger against the use of AIDS as an example in Sedgwick's essay, alongside what he sees as the essay's failure to address AIDS, quote, as a historical condition for the moods of queer criticism. That is to say, to account for how critical moods are not exemplary ethical positions or stances, but rather are produced in relation to historical events, produced by historical events, you could say. Carnick resists an understanding of performativity that would displace questions of the truth. In this spirit, he criticizes the tendency to regard Sedgwick's early work as a preeminent example of the paranoid style in queer criticism. Rather, Carnick defends epistemology of the closet from the frequent charge, of paranoia. The book is not characterized, he argues, by dark imaginings, quote, that the major modes of thought and knowledge in 20th century Western culture as a whole are structured, indeed fractured, by a chronic, now endemic crisis of homo-hetero definition. Sorry, that's just me quoting the beginning of Epistemology of the Closet. Karnik does not see that as a paranoid fantasy. Rather, in his account, Sedgwick is a careful diagnostician of this state of affairs, a true state of affairs in Karnik's telling. Regarding her outsized claims at the opening of Epistemology, he asks twice, what if she meant it? What if it's true? Early in A Few Lives, Karnik asserts, it's difficult to think of a contemporary field of critical theory whose rhetorical arsenal relies so centrally on the speech act of calling bullshit. Karnik is, of course, joining this tradition, calling bullshit on, quote, our method melodramas, the deletion of AIDS as the origin of queer thought, and, as I'm suggesting, on at least certain versions of the turn to affect and reparation in queer criticism. Now, I'm utterly magnetized by Karnik's argument, as you can probably tell because I've been talking about it this entire time. And I do see it as an urgent intervention, both in the ongoing AIDS crisis and kind of cultural criticism around that, but also in the material conditions in which we all read, work, study, teach. It's maybe because I'm so magnetized by this argument that I have not considered my own place in relation to this. As Petra said, I work in affect studies and the reading methods. So I'm going to do that for a second. And just to say, Rita Felsky, along with Jonathan Flatley, was my dissertation chair. I'm a longtime collaborator of Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus. And furthermore, I'm closely associated with both the affective turn and the reading debates and literary studies. Furthermore, David Karnik is the dedicatee of feeling backward. He's my best friend. So, surprise, I'm pretty implicated, okay? But I really love this essay. And I'm mostly just reading alongside him here, but I do want to speak up on behalf of affect studies. While it has sometimes failed to reckon with the thing itself, this field has also gotten it right sometimes, and significantly, it has opened the space to have the kind of discussion that I'm having with David here. I wanted to direct us, by way of a defense of affect studies, to a different moment in paranoid reading and reparative reading, when Sedgwick revisits the reality of AIDS, not from the perspective of knowledge, but from the perspective of feeling. Reflecting on the brutal foreshortening of so many queer lifespans, Sedgwick considers the affects of the self and one's sense of time living in this reality. She writes about two younger friends, one living with HIV and one with cancer, in relationship to her own breast cancer diagnosis. So she writes, it's hard to say, hard even to know how these relationships are different from those shared by people of different ages on a landscape where perspectival lines converge on a common disappearing point. I'm sure ours, her and her friends, are more intensely motivated. Whatever else we know there isn't time to bullshit. But what it means to identify with each other must also be very different. On this scene, an older person doesn't love a younger person as someone who will someday be where she now is, or vice versa. No one is, so to speak, passing on the family name. There's a sense in which our life narratives will barely overlap. There's another sense in which they slide up more intimately alongside one another than can any lives that are moving forward according to the regular schedule of the generations. At the end of this essay, which Kernick sees as sidelining the material reality of AIDS and therefore falling down on the job of calling bullshit, Sedgwick asserts, under the pressure of impending death, that she realizes that there isn't time to bullshit. Sedgwick's clear-eyed naming of her condition, living with advanced breast cancer, and of her likely odds, I have little chance of living to be 60, she writes, stand as a reminder of the other, less danceable ways queer writing gets. One may have qualms, certainly, about Sedgwick's penchant for cross-identification, active as ever in the equivalence she suggests between her own breast cancer diagnosis and her friend living with HIV. The question of how to make sense of the intensity of Sedgwick's identifications is only compounded, not resolved, by noting that this line in her essay repeats almost word for word a moment in David Wojnarowicz's enraged response to the death of his friend Peter Hujar in Living Close to the Knives, written in 1991, published in 1991. Or one may critique Sedgwick's lack of attention to other forms of cruel foreshortening of life, loss to poverty, migration, or state violence, although Sedgwick herself mentions the uninsured, people in dangerous industries, and those lost to racist violence. But the fact that Sedgwick invokes HIV/AIDS in a consummately material way, invoking the shaping power of mortality, that's the fact is that she invokes it in that way, is presumably in this mood of there being no time for bullshit that Sedgwick has written Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading. She means it. What if it's true? Okay, now it's part two, which is called Hear My Tale. It has an epigraph, this section, which is called, which reads, "This book is not a memoir." And that's the opening line from the introduction to Paul Preciado's Testo Junkie from 2008. Okay, to extend my thinking about both queer performativity and queer authenticity, I now turn to Susan Stryker's 1994 essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, about the village of Chamonix performing transgender rage, published in an early issue of GLQ. It's a good fit in this issue, I would say, because Stryker addresses many of the key concepts of early queer theory: performativity, the critique of the sovereign subject, and what Sedgwick later referred to as faith and exposure as a political strategy. The conceptual energy of the essay is matched by the power of Stryker's use of her own body and story. My Words begins with an anecdote that finds Stryker giving a performance lecture at a conference called Rage Across Disciplines. That's a good name, right? Rage Across Disciplines, held at Cal State San Marcos in the summer of 1993. The performance challenges both gender norms and the norms of academic behavior. So this is the opening of that essay, and Stryker recalls her place at her appearance at the lectern. I stood at the podium wearing gender-fuck drag, combat boots, threadbare Levi 501s over a black lace bodysuit, a shredded Transgender Nation t-shirt with the neck and sleeves cut out, a pink triangle quartz crystal pendant, grunge metal jewelry, and a 6-inch long marlin hook dangling around my neck in a length of heavy stainless steel chain. I decorated the set by draping my black leather biker jacket over my chair at the panelists' table. The jacket had handcuffs on the left shoulder, rainbow freedom rings on the right side lacings, and Queer Nation style stickers reading "Sex Change, Dyke," and "Fuck Your Transphobia" plastered on the back. Okay. So the scene is meant to shake the audience as well as the reader, something it still, I would argue, has the power to do, although now the shock of time travel is added to the original shock of Stryker's appearance, I would say, because it's really a sort of time capsule of the early 1990s. Stryker argues that she crafted this performance guided by the desire not to use not just to talk about gender fuck, but actually to do it, actually fuck gender. Her self-presentation is one of proud defiance, although the details are also insignia of belonging to Transgender Nation, to Queer Nation, and to the army of lovers who incited the queer revolution. Stryker shows her allegiance to the new field of queer theory as well. Perhaps most obviously, the essay is notable for its extreme acts of reverse discourse. Stryker writes that her status as a transsexual means that her very existence is bound up with technoscience, such that she is seen as less than human, a monster. Rather than disavow this label, however, Stryker inhabits it, citing precedents such as the reclamation of terms like dyke, fag, queer, slut, and whore for progressive ends. She argues that words like creature, monster, and unnatural need to be reclaimed by the transgender community. By embracing and accepting such words, she continues, we may dispel their ability to harm us. Stryker risks being identified with the non-human, even the non-organic, as she proposes reframing monster, in particular by recalling its etymological roots to warn, recasting the figure not as a debased creature, but as a harbinger of transformation. Stryker also draws heavily on Judith Butler's concept of gender performativity and the model of politics it envisions, particularly the model of politics it envisions. Stryker suggests that trans people, by inhabiting gender as unnatural, illuminate the performative and constructed nature of all gender, and thus have a role in the remaking of society. In Gender Trouble, Butler argues that the appearance of non-normative gender in her case, she's thinking primarily about drag and butch femme, could shake gender's general faith in the naturalness and stability of gender categories. The appearance of gender non-normativity, its recognition as such, can loosen the hold that gender norms have on everyone. Stryker argues along similar lines in my words, drawing attention to the way that the violence of gender assignment is made manifest by the presence of transsexuals, trans people. She writes, to encounter the transsexual body, to apprehend a transgendered consciousness articulating itself, is to risk a revelation of the constructedness of the natural order. Showing gender to be a made thing and the product of violence is something that transsexuals do by their very presence, just as Frankenstein's monster unsettles the taken for granted naturalness of the human. Confronting this fact is a heroic act and is something that Stryker calls on her readers to do, employing the aggrieved prophetic tone used by Shelley's Creature. This gives you just a sense of the kind of rhetorical performance that Stryker engages in throughout this article. Hearken unto me, fellow creatures, I who have dwelt in a form unmatched with my desire, I whose flesh has become an assemblage of incongruous anatomical parts, I who achieved the similitude of a natural body only through an unnatural process, I offer you this warning. The nature you bedevil me with is a lie. Do not trust it to protect you from what I represent, for it is a fabrication that cloaks the groundlessness of the privilege you seek to maintain for yourself at my expense. You are, as constructed as me, the same anarchic womb has birthed us both. I call upon you to investigate your nature as I have been compelled to confront mine. I challenge you to risk abjection and flourish as well as have I. Heed my words, and you may well discover the seams and sutures in yourself. Theoretically and politically, Stryker's argument meshes perfectly with Butler's, in which perception of a fracture in the sex-gender system throws all gender norms into crisis, resulting, at least ideally, in the discovery of gender's groundlessness. If straight cis people can be made to see the seams and sutures in themselves, to refuse the naturalness of gendered norms, to loosen gender categories, then it will make life much more livable for everyone. But if the theory is familiar from Butler's work of the late 80s and early 90s, the theatrical stance is not at all. Stryker adopts the brooding cadences and grandiose postures, that's her phrase, of the Gothic antihero, adopting both the persona of Frankenstein's creature and the occasion of his address to his maker. Quote, I want to lay claim to the dark power of my monstrous identity. Stryker writes, channeling what she calls transgender rage. Both the intensity of her queer fury and the stormy rhetoric put Stryker at a great distance from norms of academic discourse. In this regard, the essay forms part of a wave of experiments that characterized writing by the first generation of queer critics who, and Michael Warner, in Michael Warner's words, described as seeking to mess up the desexualized spaces of the academy, exude some rut, and reimagine the publics from and for which academic intellectuals write, dress, and perform. But Stryker's tone, her Gothic grandiloquence, distinguish her from the rhetoric of her contemporaries. Still, if Stryker's rage threatens to boil over, becoming a form of satanic rebellion for its own sake, she also expresses her desire to get with the program. Rage is ultimately to be harnessed for political transformation. She closes the essay with the final monstrous benediction, quote, may you discover the enlivening power of darkness within yourself. May it nourish your rage. May your rage inform your actions, and your actions transform you as you struggle to transform your world. So there's this boiling rage, but it can ultimately be harnessed and transformed into effective political rage for transformation. Still, not all the rage expressed in Stryker's essay can be harnessed toward the project of transformation, nor is rage the only emotion that she feels. The essay is an assemblage, a generic mashup of different voices and tones, moving from the highly theoretical to the highly personal and back again. In a section called Diary, February 18th, 1993, this section occupies the center of the essay, and in it, Stryker describes a scene in the hospital where her lover gives birth to their child. In the hospital, they are accompanied by their, quote, little tribe, a mix of family members, non-biological kin, the midwife, and the baby's father. The moment of gendering the newborn, it's a girl, brings on a major crisis for Stryker, which hits her only when she returns home alone. And this is taken from the diary. This describes her coming home from this kind of joyous, exemplary scene in the hospital. And she writes, "Finally, in the solitude of my home, I burst apart like a wet paper bag and spilled the emotional contents of my life through my hands, through the hands I cupped like a sieve over my face. For days, as I had accompanied my partner on her journey, I had been progressively opening myself and preparing to let go of whatever was deepest within. Now everything in me flowed out, moving up from inside and out through my throat, my mouth, because these things could never pass through the lips of my cunt." Now, this moment could not be more different from Stryker's opening appearance on the podium in the essay. There, she is arrayed for a public performance, her grief transformed into activist rage, fuck your transphobia. Here, in the most private section of the essay, the diary, Stryker describes her passing emotions, joy in new life, love for her partner, pride in their alternative family, but she also describes what it is to hit joy's limit. Sometimes, though, I still mourn the passing of old, more familiar ways, she begins, and recalls her former marriage, asking, how did that little Mormon boy from Oklahoma I used to be grow up to be a transsexual leather dyke in San Francisco? Stryker continues, "Home was so far behind me, it was gone forever, and there was no place to rest. Battered by heavy emotions, a little dazed, I felt the inner walls that protect me dissolve to leave me vulnerable to all that could harm me. I cried and abandoned myself to abject despair over what gender had done to me." No more proud exile, the diary finds Stryker battered by heavy weather, overwhelmed by the violence of gender. Yet here it is not clear if it is the violence of socially enforced gender norms that is the problem. What looms on the horizon is a more pervasive violence of gender, one that can only be, one that may be impervious to activist rage or to transformation. Such a bottoming out of tone, though surprising in a work of critical gender theory, is hardly to be avoided in an essay that claims the subject position of Frankenstein's monster. Things don't end well for that guy. Although the creature is capable of rage, even murderous rage, as well as defiance and disdain, his words to Victor Frankenstein about the village of Chamonix are perhaps more notable for their plaintive quality. "Hear my tale," the creature both begs and commands Dr. Frankenstein. He goes on to describe his situation as one of intolerable isolation, nearly universal rejection, and longing for companionship. But these are not merely social ills. Like Stryker, in her lowest moments, the creature feels that nature itself is conspiring against him, for it is not a misunderstanding that the world rejects Frankenstein's creature. As the creature sees it and sees his situation, his exile is deserved, the inevitable effect of his hideous appearance. While the creature looks the part of Milton's Satan, a giant roaming through the icy caverns and the snowy peaks of the Alps, his discourse often shows him to be dependent, abject, cringing, afflicted by self-doubt and even self-loathing. Again and again, the creature looks with fondness on, quote, old, more familiar ways, idealizing forms of ordinary human society from which he is absolutely excluded. In this sense, Frankenstein's creature suffers a form of social isolation fastened to the community that rejects him. He loves the cottagers most of all, and that's where he can never be. What is worse for him is that he approves the standards by which he is rejected. This is the key difference between the creature and the first-person narrator of Stryker's essay. In her lowest moments, she idealizes more familiar ways and wonders what happened to the little Mormon boy from Oklahoma. But Stryker recovers herself and realizes that she likes being a transsexual leather dyke in San Francisco. The same cannot be said for Shelley's creature, who is, to his eternal chagrin, fundamentally alone. Going to San Francisco or to hell won't help him because he is one of a kind. There is no alternative community of leather dykes or fallen angels out there waiting for him. Stryker's self-exposures still have the power to shock, and they resonate in the present. It was risky for Stryker to reveal her rage not only at society, but also at some conditions of her transgender life and embodiment. The scene in the hospital room is an instance of utopian alternative kinship, and the scene at the lectern, one of powerful conversion of personal experience into public speech and into collective space. But in addition to these two moments, Stryker reveals much thornier and even quasi-taboo feelings, longing for a normative past and despair about not being able to give birth to a child. The essay would still be powerful without the inclusion of these moments, but I see this as Stryker making good on her identification with the monster. But if this act of self-exposure is remarkable in terms of the politics of representation in the transgender community, I think it is still, it is also remarkable in the context of the rigorous questioning of the foundations of the self, characteristic of early queer theory. My words to Victor Frankenstein is performative, self-conscious in its rhetorical appeal, and it employs multiple genres and voices in this high-wire act of vicarious speech. But one of those genres is the diary, which reveals Stryker's extreme vulnerability, self-doubt, even disaggregation or dispersal, the intimately wounded heart beating inside the leather jacket. Perhaps the formulation of inside is the problem. Perhaps there is not a more real or honest Stryker than that to be found behind her performance. Perhaps the vulnerable Stryker exists alongside the declaiming Stryker, not as the mess that spills out when the public self gives way. But it is clear, nonetheless, that Stryker's revelation of despair and unperformed rage asks for a different kind of response from its readers. We do not merely recognize the constructedness of gender. We are also asked to hear Stryker's tale and to recognize that breaking with social norms involves breakage, and that losing confidence in the gender binary involves other kinds of losses as well. The ambivalence or contradiction is central to queer theory, which has turned again and again to the register of the personal, while at the same time seeking to displace it as a site of authentic expression. Stryker's holding together of these contradictions is remarkable, all the more because she relies on Victor Frankenstein's creature to do so. This raises the possibility of dating the origin of auto theory quite a bit earlier. We think of Shelley's creature as mixing reflections about the social contract and the general will with his, as he attests to the intense pain of his isolation. In tracing this tradition back this far, we can also trace back its defining ambivalence about the subject. Since in Frankenstein, it is the creature that hideous parody of man who gives voice to its consummately human lament. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that, Heather. I guess my question is about that. So the Gen Sex group together read that Stryker piece in anticipation of your talk, and I wonder maybe if you could just you did talk about this, but talk a little bit more about how that very stark acknowledgement of real loss in the body that maybe is in some ways kind of unfamiliar to the more triumphalist models of trans experience that we're encountering now, and maybe situate Stryker, in 1994, historically in that experience a little bit.
Yeah, so is Stryker, I do think about, reading this passage and that, Stryker, sort of outs herself as having been this little Mormon boy from Oklahoma. Even that is sort of historically marked, I would say, the sort of willingness to say that. So I definitely do see this as a kind of as marked historically in certain ways. Her kind of willingness to go there, and but I don't think it was, I don't think it was like acceptable at the moment, unacceptable now. Like I think it was, a sort of a transgressive speech act in the moment. And the other thing that I think is important here is that, I just was also reading, I don't know if you guys looked at, Susan has written some pieces about that piece now, in later moments, and sort of reflecting on it and revising certain things and so on. But part of the reason she's done that is because it's continues to be I think she said, the second most downloaded GLQ essay ever. So, these things have a moment, like their time of publication, but they also have a circulation and a readership. And people are still reading the shit out of that essay. This is just a basic insight from feeling backward, basically, that, times change and yet feelings are still with us. And so, and this is true for me in my teaching, which, I'm often just teaching like, garden variety of homophobia, and people are like, first day they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, prof. Like, I'm fine. My parents are cool with me. I ran the allies group in my high school. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, just wait, we'll see. Because it's my strong opinion that these feelings are still with us. I mean, obviously, I don't think that times don't change and that social changes and laws don't change our reality. And yet, transphobia, homophobia, these are very pernicious and long-lasting feelings. And, of course, also in this moment, we know that, laws can be changed back or whatever. And that's really what's happening. So I think that, there are certain ways in which this piece shows itself as being written in the early 90s in terms of its sort of way of handling certain questions of trans self-announcement and representation. But I feel that it is certainly as urgent as it has ever been in the contemporary political context, and also that, I see a great continuity in those feelings. But, people aren't going to agree with me because I see continuity in feeling from 1895 to the present. So, I'm a bit of an outlier on this point, I guess, but, I'm also a literary historian, so I tend to believe in the past pretty strongly. I do think it is out of sync with certain norms, but I take great solace from that fact, and I kind of believe in sort of presenting that work publicly because I believe in her project and what she's doing, and I think it's important. So, and if anything, sorry to go on and on about this, but I was just thinking about Sontag's. Sorry, I'm also teaching lit medicine, so I've been teaching Sontag as well. In terms of Stryker's later writing about this essay, she's really, I think, doubled down on the post-humanism of the piece, partly in relationship to some critiques about the kind of whiteness of the article. It's been critiqued for that, for sort of her unthinking use of color, the term color, the word color, but also the way that despair is linked to blackness and darkness throughout the piece. And so she's thinking about that, and the way she responds to that is partly by sort of going back to Sandy Stone and kind of tracing this sort of post-humanist kind of lineage. But for me, that's a bit ironic, really, and that's partly why I have the Paul Preciado quote up there, because I do think Paul Preciado didn't write a memoir. I do think it is something else. It's a kind of post-humanist record of experience, but not really a memoir. But I just think it's sort of ironic to claim the post-humanism of this piece that's based on this identification, a very human feeling with Shelley's monster, who is kind of the ultimate romantic hero and sort of all too human. Yes, Shakespeare's creature, Shelley's creature is literally not human and is a monster, but I don't think that makes the piece not humanist in a significant way. So those are a lot of my feelings about that piece, but I'm happy to talk about any piece of this. So yeah, can we get a microphone over here? Oh, sorry. Yeah. I can't see, so just talk.
Thank you for that talk. I wanted to ask about you've kind of pulled out these threads of kind of queer negativity that are really interesting to me, especially in this moment of just kind of unprecedented legal attacks against queer subjectivity.
Yeah.
From the legal realm, but also I was really fascinated with your quoting of Preciado's Testo Junkie, because he also talks about how his gender doesn't belong to the state or to the feminist movement or really to anyone at all, in keeping with that kind of post-humanist strain.
Right.
So my question is basically, do you think there's a real moment for gender negativity now in turning back to auto theory and to turning back to kind of the formations of queer theory today?
Following you until you asked your question, because, well, one thing is, like, auto theory seems to me so recent as to, like, turning back to it seems a bit, I mean, it's a very recent coinage, right? So I'm partly confused by that, but I also, can you just repeat the question?
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
So my question is more of, in turning to auto theory today as this kind of new this new movement,
Yeah.
are we perhaps seeing kind of like an use of earlier methods, and kind of like if we see people using, say, methods that, say, reference Preciado, is there a sort of usefulness in queer negativity today in auto theory? I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you see threads between auto theory today and the formations of queer theory in the past?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm a bit, I haven't been, like, writing or really thinking very hard about Preciado until recently, so I'm a bit, like, I have to say I'm a bit up in the air about that. I don't see Preciado, I see Preciado as quite different, and I don't see Preciado as sort of setting the terms for queer auto theory or trans auto theory today exactly. Like, I do think the book is quite different. And I see most auto theory as I would characterize as a kind of, I don't think memoir would be far off, a kind of intellectual memoir, a kind of mashup of theory and memoir. Whereas I do think Preciado has a very different project. So I would just say that. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested. Well, like everybody else, it seems like I'm interested in auto theory right now. But I'm also, I guess one of the motivations for this project, besides my kind of interest in all of these different writers, these amazing writers, and trying to think how they were sort of managing what seems to me a kind of intellectual and representational problem. Like, I am just interested in that. But one of the motivations is that people are so often saying about auto theory, like, oh, it is queer. Like, auto theory is queer. And of course, like, my struggle, like, is not queer. I mean, there's plenty of examples where you're like, that doesn't make sense. But nonetheless, it's something that people do say a lot, and it partly has to do with the sort of success of the Argonauts and things like that. But there is this idea that that there's a kind of natural fit. I don't mean to say natural in some freighted way, but a kind of progression without disruption between queer writing, between, say, feminist writing, personal as political, queer writing with some of the kind of effects that I'm talking about in the talk, and auto theory today. And what I want to do is to trouble that connection, because it seems to me that really to see a kind of seamless fit between moments of personal revelation or self-exposure, or even just anecdote in a way in queer theory with the theory itself, seems to me to miss all of the kind of animating tension and the contradiction there. Like, I don't think that was ever a sort of natural fit in sort of early 90s queer theory. So I want it to not, and I think a lot of the same kind of tensions not bedevil, using such, my language is obviously infected by Stryker and by Mary Shelley before that, but the tensions that, I don't see it as such a natural fit in auto theory either. I mean, for instance, the use of the kind of textual form of a lover's discourse for the Argonauts, when Bart was trafficking in self-revelation. Obviously, we know so much about Bart's self, and yet so excoriating at so many points of the sort of cliches of personhood, and really this deep structuralist thinker, so that his writing in fragments or his, it had a kind of aesthetics and a politics and an intellectual force behind it that I think has been sort of erased or smoothed over in its uptake in the Argonauts. I'm not really trying to criticize the Argonauts. I'm just saying that I think the sort of naturalization of that progression is tricky. And so, I'm interested, I am really interested in the Argonauts. I've thought a lot about it, but I think that the sort of coming together there of a more seamless kind of integration of the personal and the political, which I associate with the kind of feminist tradition of writing. Like, look at Adrienne Rich, look at Audre Lorde. Like, there's not this intellectual contradiction for me. There's actually an intellectual explanation and a reason and a justification for self-revelation in a lot of that writing. So I think it takes up that tradition. And then there's another sort of tradition which I, have worked on a lot in late 19th, early 20th century of sort of queer disappearance. It's more associated with the gay male tradition. It's not only there, but of a kind of withdrawal or disappearance, Pater, Wilde, et cetera, with sort of flashes of signaling the self. And that's a survival mechanism in a homophobic society. But I think it's also a writing style. And so I'm thinking about sort of trying to disaggregate, not because I don't live those things together, but I think heuristically it makes sense to kind of think about these different traditions of handling the personal and get some more sort of clarity on what we mean when we say that people use the personal in their writing, because I think there's such a wide, a really truly wide range of ways that people deploy the personal, and it means different things in these different contexts. So that's kind of what I'm trying to disentangle. And I guess I think there's always room for queer negativity, but I don't know exactly how you mean it. But obviously, it just shows up in all my work. So negativity in terms of you can't find me because I don't belong to the state, so you can't discipline me. That's a form of queer negativity. I'm talking about this sort of very findable form of abjection in the Stryker diary. So, there's different things that people mean by that. But, yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Heather, for a fantastic talk. Just along the lines of what you've been talking about so far,
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you to say a few words, given that your second section began with the citation from Testo Junkie about Can the Monster Speak, which seems to engage in a sort of different way with the questions that you've been raising through Stryker's essay.
Yeah.
And that has it is also calling bullshit. It's calling bullshit on the whole psychoanalytic establishment on the one hand.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, it's strangely impersonal in a certain way, as opposed to the way in which Stryker appropriates the persona of the monster. So it just seemed like a natural trajectory of your talk, and I was just wondering if you wanted to go there for a few minutes.
Yeah, I haven't really gone there, so I don't totally want to go there. But I think, and I obviously, not obviously, but I was thinking about you as I was reading my paper in terms of just going back to Sex and the Unbearable and those conversations about the sort of, your I think quite profound critique of affect, which I hold in my mind all the time now, as a kind of smoothing over of what's actually happening in the psyche, right? It's a kind of, precisely the monster can speak because affect is sort of in some ways known to us and can be expressed and so on. So I take it that you're getting at those kinds of questions. And, I think this is partly why I'm saying I haven't really, it's going to take some effort for me to move into talking about the Preciado because it's not in an idiom that I work in. I work in this really sort of cultural studies, humanist, affect studies idiom where, I'm interested in emotion, not affect, all of these kinds of things. So, just to say, I think it's a methodological question that, I've been thinking alongside you for quite a long time now about. I do think that in a way as I mentioned, all of these sort of challenges to the use of the personal, well, that's one that I'm very alive to as well, but I'm not really quite ready to talk about that, I guess. So I hope that's not too inside baseball as a response, but that is what how I would respond to that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for your. Am I good to ask another question?
Oh,
Are you ready for another question? I want to make sure I'm not interrupting
I
you.
just couldn't see where you were. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. Thank you so much for your amazing talk, and I am preemptively apologizing that my question will not match its quality. But as someone who has less experience with this literature, I wanted to ask a question about sort of making some things explicit. So in your discussion of Preciado and the book Testo Junkie not being a memoir, and in relating it to a series of affects, a series of fragmentation, and in talking about, in your answer to the first question, about a continuation of feeling over time,
Yeah.
I want to ask about individuality versus affect over time under particular material conditions, right? So when you read the original quotation with Stryker and the whole outfit and presenting that way at the podium, versus the idea that this kind of presentation sort of seems marked in the 1990s, but also has a kind of, it has a powerful force in this moment as well. And I think that there is a degree to which a lot of battles that were fought over reclamation in the 90s, people feel the need to fight again because some of that continuation of feeling has been lost under present conditions.
Yeah.
So it seems that in particularly the AIDS crisis, when kind of social reproduction and the continuance of queer life and identity was more reliant on community, and now where it is more reliant on particularly homogenized medical discourses, it seems that some of that kind of community building has been lost for the sake of more individualistic approaches to the self and revelation. So I'm curious if you see this literature and the continuation of feeling over time. I'm intentionally using feeling to be vague between emotion and affect.
Okay, yeah.
But the continuation over time and the potential fragmentation of this kind of these sorts of discourses as being perhaps against a sort of strain in especially trans literature of kind of like autofiction, of a sort of very individualist kind of coming of age sort of narrative view of a self, of the idea that there's a kind of like fundamental unity rather than sort of what Stryker is getting at with non-humanity and describing a sort of more fundamental break between her prior and present self. So that's kind of a jumble of thoughts.
It's not a jumble. That's a really interesting question. I thank you for it. And, you know, I mean, I think you're kind of speaking to something that, you know, I hear most often get called like neoliberalism or something, right? The kind of disappearance of communal ways of life into an individualized, sort of monadic, you know, often like familial structures, but anyway, not a kind of, you know, open mesh of collective life, but a kind of retrenchment of that, which, you know, yeah, we see it. I mean, I don't usually call it neoliberalism, but I definitely experience it, you know, to be as true. And, you know, it's tangled, right? Because, and my feelings about it are tangled because many of those possibilities or potentials are bound up with like legal rights and entitlements and marriage and, you know, all these kinds of things that, you know, I certainly have taken advantage of many of those things, right? So, and, you know, obviously, if anything is going to really change in like the U.S. or beyond, it has to happen at a collective level. So, you know, I bemoan that shrinkage of public life, but you also don't want that to be like more fati, as it's called, but like, you know, it's not like because you don't have anything else. Right? I mean, it's under those conditions that revolution can happen, but I also don't wish that on people, right? That, you know, like living unhoused can be a form of collectivity. Well, I don't think that's good, right? So it's a complicated question, I think. But just to track that trajectory and say that, I agree with what you're saying. So, and then maybe the question is sort of how to think about these kind of self-narratives in the context of an ever kind of more privatized version of the self. And is that kind of what we're seeing? I mean, yes. And, this isn't a project on auto theory. Like, it's just sort of maybe an afterword or something, just to kind of say, like, because again, I'm trying to sort of disrupt some of the taken for granted nature of that queer thing, although actually thinking about this sort of context for it is helpful. But I mean, if I were writing a book that was really focused on auto theory, then I would be much more engaged with, all of the sort of critiques of wound culture and self-culture and confessional culture, which, I mean, I'm like many people who criticize those things, I'm also addicted to it, right? Like if you want to confess, I'll be there to hear it. But I do think there are major problems or issues there that have to be addressed. So, how to think about this sort of, how to think kind of, I mean, what you're, I really associate that moment of the 1970s and collective movement with the 1970s, like many other people, because that's when, so many of those things those movements were happening more actively. So maybe just thinking about historicizing these cases more in terms of that sort of narrative, and trying to pinpoint the sort of differences between collective life and narrative and self-narratives in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, in those sort of moments, and that maybe, because I tend to think so much about the kind of intellectual trajectory of queer theory, a kind of internal history of queer theory, but to track the sort of the way that the personal is deployed in queer theory along that time in relation to that history that you're describing. I think that's very helpful comment, if I'm getting you right. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
amazing.